Welcome to AI Guardians Responsible Leadership series on AI. Welcoming this week Jim Anderson, the founder and CEO at Beacon. Beacon is the new way to manage IT and software implementations. Jim will probably give you a better explanation than that from me, but pleasure to have you on, Jim. I've known Jim in my career, but he's had a variety of leadership positions across Earthlink going way back, Vitru, where I've known him, Oracle, Socialflow as the CEO. So really experienced mind across the tech space in these areas. And so welcome to the show. Glad to have you on.
Good to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. So let's jump in real quick. So obviously this is about responsible AI, generative AI. You've spoken a lot about these subjects, and there's a lot being spoken about. So I'm curious from your perspective, like what's real and what's not, right? There's a lot of upside. There's a lot of perils here. Where are you seeing the real opportunity and threats or issues around generative AI right now?
Oh, goodness. There's so much to untangle there. So I guess the first place I'll start, Chris, is I think AI is substantive and real and transformational. It's a big deal, I guess, is the shorter way of saying that. And you mentioned Earthlink and before that Mindspring, right? The early days of the internet back in 1997. Remember the gurgly bonk dial-up modems that we then, everybody was like, this is wonderful. I wish it was faster. So we all moved rapidly into high speed. And now it's effectively a ubiquitous utility. And think of all the things that were enabled because of the internet. I feel like AI has got that kind of potential, right? And also that kind of risks, right? I mean, look at all the bad things that happen with the internet too. So we should not be naive about the challenges and about the responsibility we have to learn from past mistakes with technological innovation. But I think it is foundational, transformative, and will affect every area of every organization. Exactly how and at what speed and how much is positive and how much is negative, that's very much to be figured out.
That's absolutely fair. It is very much like the early days of internet or mobile, where you knew it was going to be big, you knew it was going to transform, but God help you in trying to
how, right? And when, right? Yeah. Favorite saying, you know what? People who predict the future, we call them futurists, right? Do you know what we call people who predict when the future is going to happen?
No,
we call them billionaires, right? So if you can figure out when this stuff is going to happen, that's the thing. Because being too early, as you know, in technology is just as bad, in many cases worse than being too late. So timing is everything, and I love what you're doing about taking an area, responsible AI and governance. Like, oh, that's a sometimes dry topic. I mean, some people love to sit around and talk about governance. Most people would rather just do stuff. Well, but if you're not thinking about that, especially in your organization, you run the risk of actually going slower rather than faster because you didn't think through the issues, and then you end up with a backlash or a set of unintended consequences because you didn't think it through.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we're so focused on it. So how are you guys thinking about generative AI at Beacon and your own role today?
We think about it a lot, and it's interesting, a couple of very tactical ways. One is just something like this. I mean, you're recording this, obviously, for use later. You probably have a tool that will automatically transcribe it, right? I mean, that's effectively using AI for transcription. Well, there are tools, and you may use them too, that automatically distill the meeting, right? Take this long transcript and distill what's the essence of it. And by the way, it's maybe half good, maybe depending on, what tool you use. Just like meeting notes taken by people are sometimes half good, right? I mean, we should, I think a lot of people expect perfection. If it's short of perfection, then the glass is half empty. I look at it the other way. I say, hey, the glass is half full. Like, would you rather start with the proverbial blank sheet of paper, or would you rather have something sort of transcribe and distill a meeting you were in? And you're like, yeah, that's right, whatever. I just do a little couple of tweaks, and then 5 minutes, I've made a pretty good set of meeting notes instead of taking 25 minutes to make a pretty good set of meeting notes. I mean, those kinds of things are what we're doing. And then on the software development side, GitHub Copilot has gotten a lot of traction. It makes developers vastly more productive. Roughly half of code seems to be completed by GitHub and Copilot in some way, shape, or form. So think about that. I'm not sure that literally translates to a 50% productivity increase for developers, but it is a measurable productivity increase for developers.
Yeah, and that's something we've talked about a lot too. Is you've always had the myth in tech circles of the 10x developer, but I really think that generative AI is going to create the 10x everything, right? You're going to have the finance person and analyst. Hell, your analyst might even become 20x everywhere they go. Are you guys thinking more about generative AI than on the back office pieces now, the things that aren't fronting with customers today?
Yeah, we are. Well, so first off, we're an enterprise software company, right? We B2B so what there's no reason for a consumer to log into Beacon. So that's our business. So of course it's what can we do to help our clients, with their software projects and help, our statistic that we like to say, we do a lot of work with governments, is 70% of software and IT projects fail in government. That's not our statistic. That's, various people have written about that. We don't believe that has to be the case. And we bring a variety of things to bear, our own software, but included and embedded in that is all of this thinking about how do I use AI smartly and in a compliant way to actually help all of this work better. And there's lots of details around that, but it's not hard to imagine half a dozen ways where AI can contribute to that mission.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And since you mentioned your work with government entities, so we had big news this week. Both the White House had the executive order on Monday. The OMB piece came out yesterday, talking about federal agency oversight. Kind of how are you seeing those regulations, U.S. trying to take leadership on this? Like how, especially because you're dealing with government entities, has this been a subject that's been started to be talked about on your end?
Not much with our customers, because again, this is all very new, and how long it takes to propagate from executive order or OMB action all the way through down to the agency level. So I think this is a months, if not years long conversation. Yeah. But I will tell you just my own personal opinion. I've seen lots of takes on the President Biden's executive order. I view it as a step in the right direction. Is it exactly right? I'm sure it's not. Are there plenty of legitimate criticisms that maybe we shouldn't be governing by executive order, that instead Congress should take action? Well, sure. I mean, that's a fair point. There may be bigger issues with Congress than them not taking action on AI right now. And I think we live in the world we live in, not the world we wish we lived in. And so I welcome these kinds of conversations, even debate about, hey, this executive order is wrong and here's why. We're never going to get anywhere without talking about these things. And as we've seen before, executive orders can be litigated quite extensively. So we'll probably see no small amount of litigation going on around that. And that's fine. It's a very messy process, but at least the process is going, and we're having these conversations. And I contrast that with the area that you and I know quite well, social media, where I think we definitely in hindsight were naive about the negative effects, or overly optimistic. Oh, that won't be that big a deal. Well, guess what? It was that big a deal. And there wasn't regulation. So you can overdo it on regulation. You can underdo it on regulation. Obviously, all the way back to the three bears, trying to find the way to get to the one that's just right is the art of it.
Yeah, and I go back way so far like you do on that same exact subject. I remember the days where Mark Zuckerberg could go to Congress and he was treated like Sam Altman is today, right? Like lauded, genius, just what do we do next? And then years later, the most villainous person that put in front of Congress ever.
Yeah. And I think, and like all of those things, he was probably not as smart or as genius the first time around, and not as dumb or malicious as he was the second time around. Everything's in the middle. But let's not try to do that exact same thing. And, we won't make the same mistakes again. We'll make a whole new set of mistakes. That's another one of my favorite things. So of course, we're not going to repeat the exact past, but let's at least be smarter about it. And I think the executive order and the action in general from governments is a good step, maybe, I hope, in the right direction. We'll see, but it's naive, and I think not even just naive, irresponsible to say, oh no, government should not be involved. Let industry figure it out, and then we'll let you know when we're ready for government to be involved. We've seen how that works, right?
Yeah, that does not work well.
So no, it does not.
Are there parts of regulation or responsible AI areas where you're interested in seeing there being advancements, like where you're even whether it was in the EO or in other areas that you really feel like they should be tackling at this stage?
Not really, and I say that because I don't think too much at the policy level, right? When you're building a company, it's all about executing well on behalf of your clients, and most of that is tactical, right? A bad strategy well executed is better than a great strategy poorly executed, is one of the aphorisms, and I generally believe that, right? I don't know about bad strategy, but a weak strategy. And so we spend most of our day, all day, every day, on those tactical items. And so I'm not thinking so much about broad sweeping, AI policy things. I'm thinking very tactically. And I'll give you an example. We're recording this meeting. So imagine going into a government agency and saying, hey, we want to record this meeting. Well, recording sort of has this, even today in 2023 post Zoom and post pandemic and Zoom, where we're all way more comfortable, it still has this air of, well, is this video going to be used against me in the future? Is this going to become part of a deposition in a court proceeding? And I guess it's possible. All of this is, it's all digital information, and who knows what will happen in the future. But if you view every video recording as a potential deposition, and therefore you don't want to have any video recordings, then you're effectively shutting off an avenue of productivity. Okay, I can't get an automatic transcription of the meeting. I can't get an automatic distillation. I can't automatically flag action items and follow-ups. And again, very sort of boring tactical details. Who cares other than in the moment about the action items in the list of action items 3 years from now in litigation? Maybe, I guess it's possible that would become relevant. But I think that's the concern I have, is that we end up shutting off avenues of innovation if we're not careful for very sort of almost mundane reasons. That, oh, video is weird and it makes people feel uncomfortable, being a good example.
Yeah, and it's one of those interesting areas where when we've talked to leaders, they're starting to get nervous in some of those areas, particularly around things that can move markets. So the idea that, hey, I've got a earnings call and someone takes that earnings call and manipulates it, takes one of my answers and changes it, and before anyone can validate it, the market's already moved on what I said.
That's I don't like that as an example. I dislike that, but it is a good example, especially when you talk about markets and seconds, right? Seconds matter in markets. So a quick manipulation that takes 5 minutes or 5 hours or 5 days to correct is a big deal in the context of markets. I will say most of what we end up doing is not market moving. In some ways, I wish it was, right? I'd love to say I move the markets. I mean, let's be real. Most of the projects that you're involved in, I'm involved in, our day-to-day work with clients. If something gets confused for 5 minutes, it's just not that big a deal. If something gets confused for 5 hours or even 5 days, it's probably not that big a deal. And frankly, a lot of what we do is not that interesting to where somebody's going to come in and manipulate, the action items from the meeting. I guess it's possible. I, again, don't want to be naive to the misuses, and I'm sure there are things I'm not thinking about. But by and large, I don't think you want to make every decision based on the market moving potential of a deep fake video with an earnings call, right? That's a particular use case that's sort of high pressure and high stakes.
Yeah, and I think that's where you'll see those pressure points start, because that's always follow where the money is, and if there's money there, that's probably where it'll get tested first. But so let's dial this back to you guys then. So you're a typical tech company, IT company. How are you guys thinking about responsible AI now? Like on a scale of 1 to 10, is it a lot? Is it little? And when you are thinking about it, what are you doing or thinking?
So on a scale of 1 to 10, probably 3. Again, tech company, things moving quickly and great. President Biden issued an executive order, sort of let me know when it matters to me, right? Is sort of the question. So we keep an eye on it, but like at a 3 level. But that's not to say that we don't try to behave responsibly every day, right? You want to anticipate. And so we definitely look at things through the lens of how can AI help what we're doing? How can it help us be more productive? I need to write a proposal to a client. Well, I'm sure you've done this too. It's like, well, I could go find an old proposal I wrote on my hard drive or in the cloud somewhere, or I can go to ChatGPT or some other large language model and say, give me a draft of a proposal to do X, Y, and Z for this type of client. And if you've done that kind of thing, you're like, holy cow, that's not right. Of course, it doesn't have the content, but the structure and the outline and the sections and the greeting and the closing and all that. I was like, wow, that's a real time saver. So it's just, that's one example. I need to write a safety plan for, lane closures on a traffic corridor or whatever, like, okay, well, guess what? 1,000 of those have been written probably just in the past year. I could look on my hard drive or in my cloud and find some, but wow, these large language models can find a lot more. So in many ways, those bigger areas that are slower moving, that have more documentation standards, guidance manuals, design manuals, those heavyweight kinds of things, requirements documents, the more of that there is, well, guess what? It's an information distillation exercise. So that's the more useful end of the AI spectrum versus, hey, we're just doing everything by the seat of our pants and there's not much of a good written roadmap for any of this. You're going to predictably get less value, I think, out of most AI queries than if there's a lot of data on which they can do their thing.
Yeah, I would agree on that. The summarization and or at least the finding and distillation piece is probably the easiest early strength of it,
Yeah.
especially in arcane areas like you might be going into.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not arcane to the people who do it, but it's certainly arcane to people like, oh wow, I've never done one of those.
Yeah. Have you guys looked at, or as an organization looked at any policies around AI yet, or even just a memorandum on what the use of AI should be? How are you just thinking about how people at the company should use it? Because you trust yourself to do that, but
Yeah.
you have to manage a whole organization around this. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, and that's where being on the relatively small size benefits us, right? Some of your listeners may be in organizations with hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people, and I think that does open up a whole new set of challenges. I know I'm behaving responsibly, but how can I make sure the organization or the people on my team, peers, those kinds of things? I think that's actually a very hard question, and it's a very different question because it gets quite a bit into organizational dynamics, right? How heavy-handed do we want to be? And just like I was saying with the video, we should have a policy about when and how we should record, meetings and what do we do with that? Well, okay, that sounds like a six month exercise with multiple committee meetings and probably 60% chance that it ends in failure and lack of consensus, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it and maybe we shouldn't do the work, but it's going to be hard, right? And that's very different than in a small 20-person organization that can move more quickly and make decisions with less of that consideration just because of the different nature of the company. So we tend to be on that smaller end of the spectrum where we're not thinking about the longer term, wow, this is a policy that's going to live on for years and we need to get it right across multiple functional areas.
Yeah, and that's always the toughest thing for small medium business, and it's actually one of the things I liked about the executive order. It bifurcated between large organizations and smaller organizations requirements, but yeah, regulation is easy for larger organizations to handle because they've got the dollars, right? They can go hire
Right.
Kinsey or Deloitte to come in and implement it, or a SOC 2 compliance is easy at that level. But when you're a small organization and you got an RFP that requires SOC 2, you look around and go, how do we get this?
Yes, a bit more of a challenge, and that's true. I mean, that's always completely independent of AI. That's been the challenge of small companies, all along, right? I don't have the big, infrastructure and compliance history, and things that will reassure you, certifications that will reassure you. But small companies have grown to big companies all the time, right? I mean, you work. That's part of the journey is you've got to work your way through that and effectively punch above your weight class. If you want to be one of those big companies, and your that downside is hopefully offset by a focus and agility that may be harder for a bigger company to match.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So last area I want to drill into a little bit was, since we both lived through it pretty specifically, was data privacy. So we saw the pathway on data privacy. You had Cambridge Analytica and environments like that led to GDPR and CCPA. Do you see this path kind of go in the same direction where you'll have some events that blow up that will speed things up, governments will speed up on their own? How do you see this comparing to how we saw data privacy legislation?
I sure hope it doesn't map that, because I don't
Okay.
think we had a very good collective path around data privacy. And some would argue there is no data privacy, or there's just almost no data privacy. Clearly, the EU in particular is taking a leadership role on trying to change that.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time with data privacy lawyers, in my previous life. And I'm going to mangle the quote, which is okay because I'm not going to mention his name, but it was a data privacy lawyer who said, hey, you need to quit thinking about this as privacy and start thinking about this as compliance.
Yeah.
And he was talking about GDPR in particular. And I thought that was really interesting, because, I think most of us want to jump to what's this trying to accomplish, which is privacy. And in many ways, that's a mistake, right? I mean, it's nice to understand what it's trying to accomplish, but what you have to comply with is not what it's trying to accomplish, but what it says.
Yeah.
And you'd love to think there's no distance between those two, but there often is. In fact, there always is, right? I mean, it's lawmaking and regulation making is an imperfect process at best, and an awful process at worst. So you've got to understand both of those. What do I have to comply with? What's the intent? And that's a little bit of a forward-looking risk reward. Okay, I don't think too many people wake up in the morning and want to be malicious or irresponsible or act badly, but yet a lot of bad behavior ends up incrementally coming out of, oh well, the law doesn't require me to do this. This isn't so bad. Sort of that progressive, and then before you know it, you end up in a Cambridge Analytica situation where if anybody were to sit down and describe that from scratch, I think everybody would have been appalled and say we can't let that happen. But it didn't happen all at once. It happened a little bit at a time, right? Progressively, people just kept pushing the boundaries. And at the risk of dating this podcast, I will say, if you're a college football fan, which I think you are, you look at what's going on at the University of Michigan and them stealing signs from the other, it's kind of fascinating to do. I think that's another one of those things. It started small, and then before you knew it, you've got this whole systematic operation where it's an intelligence gathering operation that everybody's looking at and saying, "Holy cow! How did that get to be so big?"
Yeah.
And I guarantee it didn't start that big, right? And so it's just those things. They start small, and then before you know it, they've gotten out of control.
Yeah, it's a classic case of you start in a gray zone and everyone's like, oh, that's not bad, a gray zone. Everyone does it. And then you just keep moving.
Right. Well, and in some ways, I mean, if you've got, not to make it too specific about that emerging scandal, and we don't know how that ends, but you've got a very enthusiastic young person who wants to overachieve, right? And so it's hard doing, hey, I love your enthusiasm. I love your passion for doing your job. I don't necessarily love the judgment you're showing about how far you take that. But I mean, we've all seen situations like that where somebody who's enthusiastic just goes off in a direction without the controls, without the constraints, without the supervision. And you're like, wow, that's not what I expected. And so we shouldn't be surprised by that kind of thing.
You could have verbatim described our journey through social media with that same quote. Meaning, yeah. It's the same way, right? It started with, hey, the saying always was, if you aren't buying the product, you are the product. Right. We all knew that in the industry, but it was always like for good to start, right? It was always good. Right. Hey, I know this about you. I can serve you better ads. I can serve you better products. But then it became so pervasive over time and so many third degree applications that, yeah, it became something very different as a beast. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So last piece for me here is then, so I know we said up front, God help you on trying to predict the future and, the ones who do it on time, but where do you see things in 12 months out when generative AI right now? What's your view of this world?
I, again, am going to get tactical on you. I'm not going to give you a big sweeping prediction. I'm going to give you a prediction to say we are all going to find day-to-day tasks that we have suddenly just started to rely on AI to make better. So if you're a software developer, you're using GitHub Copilot and becoming more productive. You're probably already doing that if you're a software developer. If you spend a lot of time in Excel spreadsheets, wow, you found a way to, this little AI trick has made you vastly more productive and you've got a big complicated Excel spreadsheets. If you write a bunch of documents, you probably already started to do, and you'll find some new tool that sort of helps you do what you do better. And that's one of the exciting things is these new tools are coming and going, every single day, right? And how many of them get folded into the core capabilities of the big, large language models and the big tech players? How much room is there for innovation of smaller companies on top of that? I think that's all very much in flux, but we are all going to use, which of us won't use something that makes our job easier or better on a day-to-day basis? So I think looking at that 12 months, you say, okay, what am I doing today and how am I doing my job that's different than it was before AI came along? I think we will all have probably 1, 2, 3 examples. Oh yeah, I didn't even think about that. I do this, I do that, I do the other, and I couldn't do that 18 months ago.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right on that. It's very easy for us to find the efficiencies with AI right now. Like, what are the things we do today? And I think that's going to be great for bottom lines. It's going to be great for leaders like yourself, where you're like, hey, I can now 10x what we're doing. I get really excited about the things we don't know, which is what's the innovation? It's the marginal cost on these things goes to zero. What are the things you could never do before that now suddenly can be done at scale at a reasonable cost? Yeah.
I love that too. That's the billionaire point from earlier. If we could figure out that, what that is and when to do it. And it requires a lot of imagination, right? Predicting the future and imagining what's possible with capabilities that you're still grappling to even understand, right? How could we ever have imagined social media before the internet? How could we ever have imagined artificial intelligence before the internet and computers, right? So you've got these things that you have to take it for granted before it can then sort of bake into your creative process, I think. At least if you want to be credible at it. Maybe there's some small subset of people that can imagine and look around corners and see it's almost like you're playing 3-dimensional chess at that point, trying to figure out an infinite number of permutations. So I think for most of us, that starts to become real, and all of a sudden you're in a brainstorming meeting one day, or you're trying to solve a real client problem, and you're like, I could do this, and oh wow, if I thought about it 18 months ago, I would not even ever had that idea because it wouldn't have been possible. And so I think you're exactly right. Those are the really, beyond just efficiency, and I did a 30-minute task in 20 minutes. wow, I never could have even done that, is a far more exciting, set of potential outcomes.
Yeah, I don't think it's been a long time since it's been this exciting to be an innovator in a field. Your next $1 billion plus companies are going to come out of this period right here. It's
Yeah.
probably scarier to be a big company either, because I think consumer behavior is going to change dramatically, just like it did with the internet, right? People get a hold of it, you don't know what it is, but people take control of information and other things in ways they never did before. And how does that change behavior and buying patterns and creates the Googles of the world and Amazons of the world? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. It's funny. I'm reminded, one of my brothers made a comment back in the early days of the internet. He's like, "Oh, I would never give my credit card number to anybody and buy something online." And that was a reasonable position at the point. It didn't necessarily age very well as a prediction, right? I'm fairly confident right now he buys plenty of things online, but it was sort of illustrative, right? It's like at that point, the whole risk profile, it looked sketchy. The HTTP versus HTTPS, a very arcane thing, just secure commerce, all those things. There were entire industries built around that and making people more comfortable. And obviously, look at where we've netted out.
Yeah, if you can nail that, then you're the next, like, because I remember the same things about I would never get in a stranger's car, or I'd never get strangers into my house. And
Right.
Uber nails it, Airbnb nails it, and those are $1 billion plus ideas.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But Jim, it has been a pleasure having you on. I really appreciate your insights and your time today. But thank you for coming on, and hope for all the best as Beacon moves forward here.
That's great. Thanks for having me, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Jim. Take care.